That night at Carol's place was as fun as always. We talked for hours, laughed at silly stuff, and reminisced about old memories. Before I knew it, it was past midnight and the street was quiet, with almost all the house lights off. I hugged her goodbye and walked towards my car parked a few steps ahead. It was a peaceful area, one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows each other, and strange things hardly ever happen. But that night, something about the chilly breeze and the unnerving silence made me feel a bit uneasy, like something was just off. Anyway, I got in the car and settled in, planning to rest for a few minutes before heading home. I turned on the heater and played some soft music while I leaned back in my seat. Minutes went by and I started to feel really tired. I'm not sure exactly when I dozed off, but I suddenly woke up with my heart pounding and no clue why. There was this dull, repetitive sound. Then I saw a shadow moving outside, close to the driver's window. For a moment, I thought it was just my sleepy mind playing tricks, but the sound came again, clearer this time, a gentle, rhythmic tapping like someone was testing if I was awake. The chill I felt wasn't from the night outside anymore, it was from deep inside me. My adrenaline spiked so fast it felt like my hands were glued to the steering wheel. The figure outside was tall, with something on its head, maybe a hat or hood, making it look even creepier. It moved in an odd way, almost silent except for the tapping. My instincts kicked in, and I checked the doors, feeling my heart race even faster when I confirmed they were locked. The figure kept circling the car, testing each handle, like it knew exactly how to freeze me in place. I tried to think of what to do. My right hand slowly moved toward my phone, but fear held me back, worried any sudden movement might alert it that I was watching. It was now by the passenger side, pressing its face against the window. I could see it better under the streetlight, a glimpse of hollow, almost empty eyes and a small smile, as if it was amused by my terror. I swallowed hard, feeling like my throat was filled with sand, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of this and figure out how to escape. It was a residential area, but it felt deserted, isolated, like I was miles away from any help. I thought about honking the horn to draw attention, but the fear of provoking it kept me frozen. The figure kept testing the doors, circling the car like a predator studying its prey. Then it stopped right in front of the hood, staring at me through the windshield. Time felt frozen, and the silence was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing short and shallow. Then the figure slowly lifted its hand and made a gesture I'll never forget. With an almost theatrical motion, it tilted its head to the side and waved, like a twisted hello. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to get out of there, but I was paralyzed, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Almost on autopilot, I reached for the key and turned it. The engine roared, breaking the tension, and for a second, I saw its expression change. That slight smile faded, replaced by something darker. At that moment, it stepped back and melted into the shadows of the street, leaving only my pounding heart and the hum of the engine in the silence. With my hands trembling, I pressed the gas pedal and sped out of there as fast as I could, not caring about the speed or if anyone was on the narrow road. The squeal of my tires echoed in my ears as I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing me or lurking around, but the street was empty, like nothing had happened. My thoughts were a mess, and every sound in the car seemed amplified, the ticking of the turn signal, the hum of the engine, my own heavy breathing. I drove a few blocks, searching for some sign of life, a house with lights on, anything that could make me feel safe. Finally, I spotted a 24-hour convenience store lit up at the end of the street and pulled in under the blinking neon lights. My heart was still racing and a cold sweat was trickling down my neck. I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car just yet. I just took a few deep breaths, trying to convince myself I was in a safe place now. I grabbed my phone and, with shaky hands, sent Carol a quick messy message about what had happened. She replied almost instantly, worried, telling me to stay put and that she'd come meet me. I looked around, watching every shadow, feeling the paranoia creep over me. The minutes I waited for Carol felt like hours. Every passing car made me jump, and any pedestrian on the sidewalk had me gripping the steering wheel tighter. Finally, I saw her car pull up, and a wave of relief hit me so hard I almost cried. When she got out and ran over, her familiar, concerned face made me break down. I got out and hugged her tight, telling her what happened, stammering with tears in my eyes. She looked at me, shocked and disbelieving, but there was no doubt in her eyes. We knew strange things could happen, but nothing had prepared us for this. Carol insisted I stay at her place that night. I agreed, still dazed and barely able to think straight. On the way, she called her boyfriend and gave him a quick rundown of what happened. While I stared out the window, replaying every moment, every detail of that figure's face and the sound of those taps on the window. When we got to her place, we locked everything up, checked every door and window, and sat in the living room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The night was long, and sleep seemed impossible. To this day, every time I hear a knock on a window or see a shadow move at night, I get that same cold chill down my spine. What happened that night was never explained, but it left a mark that won't go away. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what happened. I asked Carol's neighbors if anyone saw anything unusual that night, but no one reported anything strange. I even went to the police station to file a report, but the officer seemed more skeptical than concerned, saying it was probably just a prankster or some teenager messing around, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The way that figure looked, the way it moved, and the feeling it gave off wasn't normal. It felt like there was intent behind it, something I couldn't understand but still haunts my thoughts. To this day, when I tell this story, I see the disbelief in people's eyes. Some say I was dreaming, others that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me because I was tired. But I know what I saw and how I felt. That night left a lingering insecurity that I carry with me whenever I'm alone in a dark place. No matter how much I try to forget, the soft tapping on the window still echoes in my mind, bringing back the memory of that small smile and those hollow eyes. I never found out who or what was out there, but the feeling of being watched by something unknown is something I'll never shake off.
My name's Marco, just an ordinary guy who never thought a peaceful night could turn into a nightmare. It was a Friday night, and I was chilling on my couch after a long, exhausting week at work. The air outside was cool, and the night was almost completely silent, with only the sound of leaves rustling in my backyard. I've always enjoyed the peace of my place, far from the city noise, and that night seemed just like any other. The only light in the room came from a small lamp, casting shadows on the walls. But, as many know, silence can be deceiving. While trying to focus on the show I was watching, a soft sound caught my attention. It was a faint scratching, something I'd never heard before. The noise was coming from the back window. My heart started to race, and a strange feeling crept over me. I tried to brush it off, thinking it might just be an animal, like a cat or a squirrel, but curiosity got the best of me, and I peeked through the curtain. I carefully glanced out, and then, to my shock, saw a stranger dressed in dirty work clothes and a beanie, standing by the fence, staring at my house with an intense look that sent chills down my spine. I froze when I saw that guy standing there. My stomach twisted, and all I could think was, what does he want? Was he lost? Or was something wrong? The way he stood there, his head tilted, gave me a deep sense of unease. The dim light didn't help, and I wondered if he could see me through the curtains. My instincts told me to step back, but I couldn't move, stuck in this bizarre scene. Then the guy started moving, and my heart leapt. He walked over to the back door and began tugging at the handle, trying to open it. My chest tightened, and my first thought was to call the cops. But at the same time, I was scared I was just overreacting. What if he was just at the wrong house? A bunch of doubts filled my mind as I stood there, unsure of what to do. Meanwhile, the stranger kept working at the door, and the tension in the room was so thick, I could almost feel it weighing down on me. The sound of the doorknob echoed in my head, and I knew I had to make a decision. I grabbed my phone and decided to call the police, even if it felt like I was overdoing it. With my hand shaking, I slowly dialed and waited for someone to pick up. The operator answered, and as I tried to explain what was happening, my eyes never left the man outside. He looked more frustrated now, trying to force the door open, even ramming it with his shoulder, like he was determined to get inside. Each thud echoed inside me, and it felt like my heart was going to jump out of my chest. As I spoke on the phone, I noticed this stranger looking around, like he was making sure no one else was watching. That's when he saw me. Our eyes met, and I knew he froze. There was something in the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like a challenge. I felt my whole body tremble, but I somehow kept my voice steady while talking to the police. They'd promised to send a car over, but the wait felt like forever. Each second that passed, the situation grew more intense. The guy came even closer to the door, and I wondered if he really thought he could get in. He kept glancing at the window, and I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. Fear wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, and each of his movements made me feel like something could happen at any moment. It was like time had stopped, and the only thing in that moment was me and this stranger. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what he wanted. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped trying the door and started knocking on the back window with his hand. The sound was deafening, like a drum pounding through the house. My heart was about to leap out of my chest, and I didn't know if I should scream or hide. That's when I heard sirens in the distance. Relief began to wash over me, but the stranger seemed to notice the police were coming too. He looked around, showing frustration, like he was about to give up, not before giving me one last look. He quickly turned and started running toward the fence, his footsteps thudding on the ground. My heart was racing, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins, and I wondered if he'd get away before the police arrived. What was he even after? What did he think he'd find here? Watching him disappear into the darkness left me unsettled, and all I could think was what might have happened if I hadn't called the cops. What if he'd gotten inside? 100 questions spun in my head as I tried to process it all. Within minutes, I heard the cops shouting outside. "Police, hands up," they yelled. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching gave me a sense of hope, but also a sinking. I walked over and opened the door, watching as the officers searched the area, looking for the guy. They moved fast and professionally, but I was in shock, barely processing what had just happened. One of the officers came over and asked if I was okay. I tried to answer, but honestly, I was just relieved, feeling like things were finally under control. The officers started searching the area, and I followed them, still shaking. One of them asked if I'd seen which way the man had gone. I'd pointed in the direction he'd run, trying to stay calm. The lights from their squad car lit up the yard, and I watched as they carefully scanned the area. There was an odd feeling in the air, like something was still lurking, but the adrenaline was fading, leaving me deeply exhausted. The question nagging at me was, who was that guy? What did he want from me? As the cops spread out in my yard, one of them found something by the fence. It was a worn-out glove covered in dirt, and I quickly realized it might belong to him. The officer looked at me with concern. He explained that the man seemed to have been trying to get into my house for some reason, but now there was no trace of him. They started gathering evidence, and as they did, I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Part of me was glad to be safe, but part of me couldn't shake the image of that stranger. How did he know I was alone? After a while, one of the officers came up to me and asked if I'd like to make a statement. I agreed, still trying to collect my thoughts and make sense of what happened. I told them about the noise I heard, about seeing the man peering through the window, and how he tried to open the door. The officer listened closely, jotting it all down. He told me they'd had a few calls about a similar stranger and that there were reports in the neighborhood too. Knowing it wasn't just me, that others had seen him too, made me feel uneasy. As we talked, The tension in my house started to ease up, but the fear was still there, hanging in the air. The officer assured me they'd patrol the area and told me to stay alert for anything suspicious. I thanked him, and as he walked away, I realized that night wouldn't be the same for me. Those few hours of peace had turned into a nightmare. Looking out the window, I saw the flashing lights of the squad car, but I felt empty inside. Something had changed that night, and I knew I'd never see my home the same way again. After talking with the police, I went back to the couch and tried to relax, but I couldn't. The image of the stranger was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about what he might have intended. The night felt longer than ever, and the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Even knowing the police were nearby, I couldn't relax. The thought that someone so strange and potentially dangerous had tried to get into my house was terrifying. I wondered if I'd be able to sleep at all that night. The next morning came, but the fear hadn't faded. Daylight couldn't erase the shadows of the night before, but I knew I had to move forward. The police promised to keep investigating, but I didn't want to just wait around. That experience taught me to stay alert, to be mindful of my space, and to value the safety we often take for granted. A few weeks later, life started to feel normal again, but the memory of that night still lingers. Now, every time I hear a noise at night, I get a chill down my spine, reminding me that sometimes danger can be closer than we think.
That night, the vibe was just off. The air was cold and heavy, and the stars, which usually lit things up, looked pretty dim. I'd heard about trespassers around the area, but I never thought it would happen on my land. I grabbed my flashlight and the old shotgun I keep more for peace of mind than anything else. I walked down the dirt path toward the barn, which, at that hour, looked a lot creepier than usual. The ground creaked under my feet, and the sound echoed in the darkness. When I reached the barn, a chill ran down my spine, making me pause for a second. The door was open, swinging with the wind, and there was this weird smell in the air, a mix of wet hay and something metallic I couldn't place. I turned on the flashlight and stepped inside, my heart racing. Shadows danced on the walls, and suddenly I heard heavy, awkward footsteps coming from within. The sound grew louder, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and then I saw a scruffy figure appear in the dark, moving in this strange, unsettling way. I couldn't take my eyes off that figure. It started swinging its tool back and forth, almost like it was playing with it, but in a way that only made my fear worse. The stillness of the night was gone, replaced by the pounding of my heart so loud I could barely hear its murmuring. I took a deep breath and tried to speak, my voice shaky. "Hey, are you okay? Need any help?" For a second, it stopped and tilted its head to the side, like it was processing my words, but then it went back to muttering, this time faster, more agitated. Before I could even think about running or reacting, it took a quick step toward me, raising the tool. That was all it took to kick in some survival instinct I didn't even know I had. I jumped to the side, stumbling over a pile of hay and almost falling. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled onto the ground, its light now pointed upward, casting even creepier shadows on the barn walls. The figure stopped again, this time letting out a low, dry laugh that echoed through the space. Panic took over, and all I could think was to get out of there as fast as I could. With my heart in my throat, I crawled backward, trying to grab the flashlight without losing sight of the figure. It kept walking toward me, each step heavy and slow, like it was setting the rhythm of my fear. I managed to grab the flashlight from the floor and aimed it at its face, hoping it'd stop. For a moment, it pulled back and raised a hand to shield its eyes, as if the light was bothering it. I took that split second to get up and run toward the barn door. The sound of the creaking floor and my own labored breathing were all I could hear. When I reached the door and stepped outside, I quickly turned back to see if it was following me. There it was, standing in the doorway, with the flashlight only lighting up half of its face. Its eyes, now more visible, had this strange glint, and it stared at me with a mix of anger and curiosity. It didn't take another step, just stood there, whispering something I couldn't make out. I ran to the house as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. To this day, whenever I think about that night, the sound of those footsteps and that dry laugh still send chills down my spine. The next morning, with adrenaline still pumping through me, I went back to the barn, this time with the daylight giving me some courage. The door was still open, swinging slightly in the wind, but everything inside looked more normal than it had the night before. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints except my own. The tool it was holding was gone, which made me even more uneasy. I searched the place, looking for any clue that could explain what happened, but it was like the whole thing had just been a nightmare. The usual peace of the countryside now felt heavy, like it was hiding something. I talked to a few neighbors about what I saw, but no one had heard or seen anything strange. They said it might have been a wanderer, someone lost or troubled, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The way it moved, the murmuring, that look, it's not something you just forget. Since that night, I've avoided going to the barn after dark, and whenever I hear a noise out in the field, my heart races. I don't know who or what that figure was, but the memory of it still leaves me feeling like someday it might come back. After that night, my routine changed. I started double-checking all the doors and windows before bed, and I'd always leave a light on. The countryside, once a place of peace and my little escape, now felt different, like it was keeping secrets I couldn't understand. Even as the days went by, any unusual noise had me on edge. No matter how much I tried convincing myself it was just some lost person or someone in trouble, deep down, I knew there was more to that night than I could explain. To this day, I still don't know what that was. I haven't seen anyone lurking around since, and that figure hasn't come back. But the memory of that face, the way it looked at me, and that dry laugh still haunt me. When I tell the story, some people think I'm exaggerating. Others give me that doubtful look, but I know what I saw. And even though things have gone back to normal around the farm, I still feel like that night was some kind of warning. It's something that, even with time, I've never been able to shake.
That night had been a long one. I was heading back from the library, tired after a study session that felt like it would never end. The streets were almost empty, lit only by a few streetlights and the darkened storefronts. The silence of the city at night always gave me a weird feeling, but at that moment, all I could think about was getting home and crashing into bed. That's when I noticed a car turning the corner behind me, its headlights on low. I thought it was just a coincidence, so I kept walking, but a sense of unease started creeping up on me. As I kept walking, I noticed the car was keeping the same distance, following slowly and turning every time I took a new street. I tried not to panic, but my heart started beating faster. I looked over my shoulder a few times, trying to play it cool, but the car was still there, mirroring my every move. When I turned the last corner before reaching my building, I saw the car go straight ahead and disappear. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I got closer to the building's entrance, I heard an engine slowing down, and the headlights reappeared, parking near the curb. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I looked around, hoping to see someone nearby, but the street was completely empty. The car sat there for a few seconds that felt like forever, until the driver's door slowly opened and a guy got out. He was wearing a dark jacket with a hood and was walking toward me in a way that made me even more nervous. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt heavy with fear, like they were glued to the ground. The only sound I could hear was my heart pounding so hard, it felt like it might explode. On impulse, I managed to move, pulling my keys from my pocket with trembling hands. I tried to unlock the building door as quickly as I could, but it felt like the key just wouldn't fit. The guy kept getting closer, and each step seemed quicker. When I finally got the key to turn, I shoved the door open and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I looked through the small window on the door and saw he'd stopped on the sidewalk, staring at me. He didn't try to come in, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me while I tried to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to calm my breathing, which came out in short gasps. The hallway was silent, and the only light was a flickering bulb on the far side. I looked through the window again, and he was still there, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. That feeling of helplessness kept me frozen. I thought about grabbing my phone to call someone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Time seemed to drag on, with each second adding to the tension. Then, he took a step back, still watching me, and slowly walked back to his car. He got in, but he didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there a little longer, like he wanted to make sure I knew he was in control. Finally, the headlights came on, and the car pulled away slowly. disappearing around the corner. Even after he was gone, I just stood there, unable to move, trying to process everything that had just happened. Relief came, but it was mixed with a fear I'd never felt before. It was only after a few minutes that I could finally go up to my apartment and lock the door. I spent the rest of the night thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't acted quickly. That night, sleeping was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the image of that guy standing on the sidewalk, hear the sound of his footsteps. What puzzled me the most was why he left so suddenly. Was he just trying to scare me? Or did he have something more in mind and then decided against it? The next day, I told a few friends about it, and their reactions were mixed. Some thought I was overreacting, while others said I should have called the cops, but I knew what I felt in that moment was real. The fear of not knowing what that person wanted or how far he'd go. Since then, I've never come home without being fully aware of everything around me. I started avoiding walking alone at night, and when I do have to, I walk faster, always looking over my shoulder. The car, that dark jacket, the way he stared at me. It's all etched in my mind as a constant reminder. I still don't know who he was or why he did that, but that feeling of being followed and watched has stayed with me. It's like, from that night on, I learned that even in a familiar city, there can be surprises you'd never want to face.
It was late at night, and I was heading home after a long day at the office. The subway was emptier than usual, with only a few people scattered around the car. The sound of the train on the tracks and the gentle rocking was making me feel a bit dizzy from exhaustion. But something caught my attention. A man across the car was staring at me. At first, I thought he was just lost in thought, but every time I looked away and glanced back, there he was, eyes fixed. He was tall and wore a heavy black coat that seemed way too warm for this time of year. The discomfort grew when I realized he wasn't just looking at me. His eyes seemed to follow my every move, even the slightest ones. I tried to brush it off, maybe he was waiting for someone or just staring without really thinking. But with each passing minute, the tension built, and the ride felt longer. When my stop finally came, I got up, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw the man stand up too, moving slowly, still with that empty stare. I walked toward the door, trying to stay calm, but the thought that he might be following me made my mind race. I stepped off the train, feeling the cooler air from the platform hit my face, but it didn't calm the heightened alert running through my body. I glanced quickly over my shoulder and saw the man leaving the train with the same expression, walking at my pace. The station was almost empty, with only the distant sound of another train approaching and a few flickering lights above. My first instinct was to pick up my pace, but I didn't want to show any fear. I headed toward the exit, hearing my own footsteps echoing, and right behind his steady, synchronized steps. With each step I took, the tension grew. I tried to think of quick options. Duck into the convenience store near the exit, run toward the security guard stationed further down, or even hop back on the train before it left. But for some reason, I kept walking, his footsteps echoing closer with each one. I turned left toward the stairs that led to the exit, and he did the same, keeping the same distance. The sound of his footsteps seemed louder now, almost drowning out the rapid beat of my heart, which was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I climbed the stairs, gripping the handrail with sweaty hands, trying to look calm, but the sound of his footsteps behind me only made my heart race faster. Each step felt like it took forever, and I had the gut feeling he was about to do something any second. When I reached the top, I glanced out of the corner of my eye and saw he was still following, with that fixed stare that made it clear he was tracking me on purpose. The station looked even emptier than before, and the only sounds breaking the silence were our footsteps. The exit was close, and I decided to switch directions suddenly, heading toward a more well-lit area where I knew there were security cameras. He hesitated for a moment, but then kept following. My breathing was heavy, and I felt sweat trickling down my forehead. I passed under a camera and made sure to look right at it, just to show I knew he was on my tail. That's when he stopped out of nowhere. He just stood there, looking at me with this weird expression, like he was deciding what to do. After a few seconds, he turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the station. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, and the mix of relief and fear made me feel a little lightheaded. I looked back again just to make sure he was really gone. The station felt emptier and stranger than before, but I took a deep breath and headed toward the exit as fast as I could. It was only when I reached the street, with the streetlights and the sight of passing cars, that I started to feel a little safer. The feeling of finally being somewhere with people around was a huge relief. When I got home, I locked the door and leaned against it for a while, trying to calm down. I couldn't sleep well that night. The image of him following me and that unblinking stare kept replaying in my head. The next day, every time I thought about it, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't tell anyone right away, but the feeling that it was all too real stuck with me. Since then, whenever I come home late at night, I'm more alert, watching every detail around me. That experience left me on edge, like someone could show up out of nowhere at any moment. That night taught me that even in places that seem familiar and safe, the unexpected can happen and catch you.
These stories might sound like scenes from a horror movie, but for those who lived through each tense, terrifying moment, they were real and downright chilling. From strangers appearing out of nowhere, silently following, to unsettling encounters in places we usually feel safe, these tales are reminders that the unexpected can be lurking, whether on a quiet night or in a familiar spot. If these stories got you curious and you want to hear more spine-chilling experiences, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we share first-hand accounts from people who've faced pure terror, coming face to face with the unexplainable. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of the next stories. After all, who knows what might be waiting round the next corner? Or maybe right behind you.